The Social Contract, or Principles of Political Right, by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1762, translated 1782 by G.D.H. Cole. This is a recording by Audioofclassics. If you enjoy, please consider subscribing. Forward. This little treatise is part of a longer work which I began years ago without realizing my limitations, and long since abandoned. Of the various fragments that might have been extracted from what I wrote, this is the most considerable, and, I think, the least unworthy of being offered to the public. The rest no longer exists. Book 1. I mean to inquire if, in the civil order, there can be any sure and legitimate rule of administration, men being taken as they are and laws as they might be. In this inquiry, I shall endeavor always to unite what right sanctions with what is prescribed by interest, in order that justice and utility may in no case be divided. I enter upon my task without proving the importance of the subject. I shall be asked if I am a prince or a legislator to write on politics. I answer that I am neither, and that is why I do so. If I were a prince or a legislator, I should not waste time in saying what wants doing. I should do it, or hold my peace. As I was born a citizen of a free state and a member of the sovereign, I feel that, however feeble the influence my voice can have on public affairs, the right of voting on them makes it my duty to study them, and I am happy, when I reflect upon governments, to find my inquiries always furnish me with new reasons for loving that of my own country. 1. Subject of the first book. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. One thinks himself the master of others, and still remains a greater slave than they. How did this change come about? I do not know. What can make it legitimate? That question I think I can answer. If I took into account only force, and the effects derived from it, I should say, as long as a people is compelled to obey and obeys, it does well. As soon as it can shake off the yoke, and shakes it off, it does still better, for regaining its liberty by the same right as took it away. Either it is justified in resuming it, or there was no justification for those who took it away. But the social order is a sacred right, which is the basis of all other rights. Nevertheless, this right does not come from nature, and must therefore be founded on conventions. Before coming to that, I have to prove what I have just asserted. 2. The first societies. The most ancient of all societies, and the only one that is natural, is the family. And even so, the children remain attached to the father only so long as they need him for their preservation. As soon as this need ceases, the natural bond is dissolved. The children, released from the obedience they owed to the father, and the father, released from the care he owed his children, return equally to independence. If they remain united, they continue so no longer naturally, but voluntarily, and the family itself is then maintained only by convention. This common liberty results from the nature of man. His first law is to provide for his own preservation. His first cares are those which he owes to himself, and, as soon as he reaches years of discretion, he is the sole judge of the proper means of preserving himself, and consequently becomes his own master. The family then may be called the first model of political societies. The ruler corresponds to the father, and the people to the children, and all, being born free and equal, alienate their liberty only for their own advantage. The whole difference is that, in the family, the love of the father for his children repays him for the care he takes of them, while, in the state, the pleasure of commanding takes the place of the love which the chief cannot have for the peoples under him. Grotius denies that all human power is established in favor of the governed, and quotes slavery as an example. His usual method of reasoning is constantly to establish right by fact. It would be possible to employ a more logical method, but none could be more favorable to tyrants. It is then, according to Grotius, doubtful whether the human race belongs to 100 men, or that 100 men to the human race, and throughout his book he seems to incline to the former alternative, which is also the view of Hobbes. On this showing, the human species is divided into so many herds of cattle, each with its ruler, who keeps guard over them for the purpose of devouring them. As a shepherd is of a nature superior to that of his flock, the shepherd of men, i.e., their rulers, are of a nature superior to that of the peoples under them. Thus, Philo tells us, the Emperor Caligula reasoned, concluding equally well either that kings were gods or that men were beasts. The reasoning of Caligula agrees with that of Hobbes and Grotius. Aristotle, before any of them, had said that men are by no means equal naturally, but that some are born for slavery and others for dominion. Aristotle was right, but he took the effect for the cause. Nothing can be more certain than that every man born in slavery is born for slavery. Slaves lose everything in their chains, even the desire of escaping from them. They love their servitude, as the comrades of Ulysses loved their brutish condition. If then there are slaves by nature, it is because there have been slaves against nature. Force made the first slaves, and their cowardice perpetuated the condition. I have said nothing of King Adam or Emperor Noah, father of the three great monarchs who shared out the universe. Like the children of Saturn, whom some scholars have recognized in them, I trust to getting due thanks for my moderation. For, being a direct descendant of one of these princes, perhaps of the eldest branch, how do I know that a verification of titles might not leave me the legitimate king of the human race? In any case, there can be no doubt that Adam was sovereign of the world, as Robinson Crusoe was of his island, as long as he was its only inhabitant, and this empire had the advantage that the monarch, safe on his throne, had no rebellions, wars, or conspirators to fear. 3. The right of the strongest. The strongest is never strong enough to be always the master, unless he transforms strength into right and obedience into duty. Hence the right of the strongest, which, though to all seeming meant ironically, is really laid down as a fundamental principle. But are we never to have an explanation of this phrase? Force is a physical power, and I fail to see what moral effect it can have. To yield to force is an act of necessity, not of will. At the most, an act of prudence. In what sense can it be a duty? Suppose for a moment that this so-called right exists. I maintain that the sole result is a mass of inexplicable nonsense. For if force creates right, the effect changes with the cause. Every force that is greater than the first succeeds to its right. As soon as it is possible to disobey the impunity, disobedience is legitimate, and the strongest being always in the right, the only thing that matters is to act so as to become the strongest. But what kind of right is that which perishes when force fails? If we must obey perforce, there is no need to obey because we ought, and if we are not forced to obey, we are under no obligation to do so. Clearly, the word right adds nothing to force. In this connection, it means absolutely nothing. Obey the powers that be. If this means yield to force, it is a good precept, but superfluous. I can answer for its never being violated. All power comes from God, I admit, but so does all sickness. Does that mean that we are forbidden to call in the doctor? A brigand surprises me at the edge of a wood. Must I not merely surrender my purse on compulsion? But even if I could withhold it, am I in conscience bound to give it up? For certainly the pistol he holds is also a power. Let us then admit that force does not create right, and that we are obliged to obey only legitimate powers. In that case, my original question recurs. 4. Slavery. Since no man has a natural authority over his fellow, and force creates no right, we must conclude that conventions form the basis of all legitimate authority among men. If an individual, says Grotius, can alienate his liberty and make himself the slave of a master, why could not a whole people do the same and make itself subject to a king? There are in this passage plenty of ambiguous words which would need explaining, but let us confine ourselves to the word alienate. To alienate is to give or to sell. Now a man who becomes the slave of another does not give himself, he sells himself, at the least for his subsistence. But for what does a people sell itself? A king is so far from furnishing his subjects with their subsistence that he gets his own only from them. And, according to Rabelais, kings do not live on nothing. Do subjects then give their persons on condition that the king takes their goods also? I fail to see what they have left to preserve. It will be said that the despot assures his subjects civil tranquility. Granted, but what do they gain if the wars his ambition brings down upon them, his insatiable avidity, and the vexatious conduct of his ministers press harder on them than their own dissensions would have done? What do they gain if the very tranquility they enjoy is one of their miseries? Tranquility is found also in dungeons, but is that enough to make them desirable places to live in? The Greeks, imprisoned in the cave of the Cyclops, lived there very tranquilly, while they were awaiting their turn to be devoured. To say that a man gives himself gratuitously is to say what is absurd and inconceivable. Such an act is null and illegitimate, from the mere fact that he who does it is out of his mind. To say the same of a whole people is to suppose a people of madmen, and madness creates no right. Even if each man could alienate himself, he could not alienate his children. They are born men and free. Their liberty belongs to them, and no one but they has the right to dispose of it. Before they come to years of discretion, the father can, in their name, lay down conditions for their preservation and well-being, but he cannot give them irrevocably and without conditions. Such a gift is contrary to the ends of nature, and exceeds the right of paternity. It would therefore be necessary, in order to legitimize an arbitrary government, that in every generation the people should be in a position to accept or reject it. But were this so, the government would be no longer arbitrary. To renounce liberty is to renounce being a man, to surrender the rights of humanity and even its duties. For him who renounces everything, no indemnity is possible. Such a renunciation is incompatible with man's nature. To remove all liberty from his will is to remove all morality from his acts. Finally, it is an empty and contradictory convention that sets up, on the one side, absolute authority, and, on the other, unlimited obedience. Is it not clear that we can be under no obligation to a person from whom we have the right to exact everything? Does not this condition alone, in the absence of equivalence or exchange, in itself involve the nullity of the act? For what right can my slave have against me when all that he has belongs to me, and, his right being mine, this right of mine against myself is a phrase devoid of meaning? Grotius and the rest find in war another origin for the so-called right of slavery, the victor having, as they hold, the right of killing the vanquished. The latter can buy back his life at the price of his liberty, and this convention is the more legitimate because it is to the advantage of both parties. But it is clear that this supposed right to kill the conquered is by no means deducible from the state of war. Men, from the mere fact that, while they are living in their primitive independence, they have no mutual relations stable enough to constitute either the state of peace or the state of war, cannot be naturally enemies. War is constituted by a relation between things, and not between persons, and, as the state of war cannot arise out of simple personal relations, but only out of real relations, primitive war, or war of man with man, can exist neither in the state of nature, where there is no constant property, nor in the social state, where everything is under the authority of the laws. Individual combats, duels, and encounters are acts which cannot constitute a state, while the private wars, authorized by the establishments of Louis IX, King of France, and suspended by the peace of God, are abuses of feudalism, in itself an absurd system if ever there was one, and contrary to the principles of natural right and to all good polity. War then is a relation, not between man and man, but between state and state, and individuals are enemies only accidentally, not as men, nor even as citizens, but as soldiers, not as members of their country, but as its defenders. Finally, each state can have for enemies only other states, and not men, for between things disparate in nature, there can be no real relation. Furthermore, this principle is in conformity with the established rules of all times and the constant practice of all civilized peoples. Declarations of war are intimations less to powers than to their subjects. The foreigner, whether king, individual, or people, who robs, kills, or detains the subjects without declaring war on the prince, is not an enemy, but a brigand, even in real war, a just prince, while laying hands in the enemy's country on all that belongs to the public, respects the lives and goods of individuals. He respects rights on which his own are founded. The object of the war being the destruction of the hostile state. The other side has a right to kill its defenders while they are bearing arms, but as soon as they lay them down and surrender, they cease to be enemies or instruments of the enemy, and become once more merely men, whose life no one has any right to take. Sometimes it is possible to kill the state without killing a single one of its members, and war gives no right which is not necessary to the gaining of its object. These principles are not those of Grotius. They are not based on the authority of poets, but derived from the nature of reality and based on reason. The right of conquest has no foundation other than the right of the strongest. If war does not give the conqueror the right to massacre the conquered peoples, the right to enslave them cannot be based upon a right which does not exist. No one has a right to kill an enemy except when he cannot make him a slave, and the right to enslave him cannot therefore be derived from the right to kill him. It is accordingly an unfair exchange to make him buy at the price of his liberty his life, over which the victor holds no right. Is it not clear that there is a vicious cycle in founding the right of life and death on the right of slavery, and the right of slavery on the right of life and death? Even if we assume this terrible right to kill everybody, I maintain that a slave made in war or a conquered people is under no obligation to a master, except to obey him as far as he is compelled to do so. By taking an equivalent for his life, the victor has not done him a favor. Instead of killing him without profit, he has killed him usefully. So far then is he from acquiring over him any authority, in addition to that of force, that the state of war continues to subsist between them. Their mutual relation is the effect of it, and the usage of the right of war does not imply a treaty of peace. A convention has indeed been made, but this convention, so far from destroying the state of war, presupposes its continuance. So, from whatever aspect we regard the question, the right of slavery is null and void, not only as being illegitimate, but also because it is absurd and meaningless. The words slave and right contradict each other, and are mutually exclusive. It will always be equally foolish for a man to say to a man or to a people, I make with you a convention wholly at your expense and wholly to my advantage. I shall keep it as long as I like, and you will keep it as long as I like.